Hello and welcome. In this presentation, we will be discussing tumor lysis syndrome in adults, focusing on its prevention, diagnosis, triage, and management. Before we begin, please note that this content is for medical education purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice and should not be used for direct patient care or clinical decision-making. So, what exactly is tumor lysis syndrome, or TLS? It is a true oncologic emergency that results from the rapid death of malignant cells, most often after the initiation of chemotherapy. This massive cell lysis releases a flood of intracellular contents, such as potassium, phosphate, and nucleic acids, into the bloodstream. The body's normal homeostatic mechanisms are simply overwhelmed, leading to severe metabolic derangements. It's critical to understand that TLS typically begins within 12 to 72 hours after starting cytotoxic therapy, though it can also occur spontaneously in very aggressive, highly proliferative tumors. If it is not anticipated and managed proactively, TLS can be life-threatening. The key teaching point here, which we will return to, is this: anticipate TLS before it happens. Prevention is always the best strategy. Let's take a closer look at the pathophysiology to understand the metabolic cascade that occurs in TLS. When tumor cells lyse, they release their contents, triggering three major pathological pathways. First, the breakdown of nucleic acids leads to a surge in uric acid production. These nucleic acids are catabolized into hypoxanthine, then xanthine, and finally uric acid. Uric acid is poorly soluble, especially in the acidic environment of the distal renal tubules. When its concentration rises, it precipitates into crystals, which can obstruct the tubules and lead to acute kidney injury. Second, we have hyperphosphatemia. Malignant cells can have up to 4 times the concentration of phosphorus as normal cells. When released, this excess phosphate binds with calcium, causing two problems: acute, symptomatic hypocalcemia, and the deposition of calcium phosphate crystals, which further damages the kidneys and other tissues. Finally, the direct release of potassium from lyse cells causes hyperkalemia. This is often exacerbated by the concurrent renal injury, which impairs potassium excretion. The resulting hyperkalemia is a major driver of the life-threatening cardiac arrhythmias and risk of sudden death seen in TLS. Now, how do we formally diagnose TLS? We use the Cairo-Bishop classification system, which defines both laboratory and clinical TLS. For a diagnosis of laboratory TLS in an adult, a patient must have 2 or more of the following metabolic abnormalities occurring within the same 24-hour period. Hyperuricemia, defined as a uric acid level of 8.0 milligrams per deciliter or higher, or a 25% increase from their baseline. Hyperphosphatemia, with a phosphate level of 4.5 milligrams per deciliter or higher, or a 25% increase from baseline. Hyperkalemia, defined as a potassium level of 6.0 millimoles per liter or higher, or a 25% increase. And finally, hypocalcemia, with a corrected calcium level below 7.0 milligrams per deciliter. Building on that, we have the definition of clinical TLS. This occurs when a patient meets the criteria for laboratory TLS and develops at least one associated clinical manifestation. These manifestations are direct consequences of the metabolic derangements we discussed. They fall into 3 main categories. First, cardiac manifestations, which include life-threatening dysrhythmias or even sudden death. These are primarily driven by severe hyperkalemia, but can also be influenced by hypocalcemia and hyperphosphatemia. Second, neurologic manifestations, such as seizures, neuromuscular irritability like tetany or hypotension, which are classic consequences of significant hypocalcemia. And third, renal manifestations, defined as acute kidney injury. This is diagnosed by a rise in serum creatinine of at least 1.5 times the upper limit of normal, an absolute increase of 0.3 milligrams per deciliter, or a significant reduction in urine output to less than 0.5 milliliters per kilogram per hour for 6 hours or more. A critical step in managing TLS is to identify high-risk patients before starting therapy. We use a 3-tier system to stratify this risk. Patients in the high-risk category have a greater than 5% chance of developing TLS. This group is primarily composed of patients with highly proliferative hematologic malignancies. This includes all patients with Burkitt lymphoma or leukemia, which carries the highest risk. It also includes patients with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or ALL, who present with a white blood cell count of 100,000 or higher, or a lactate dehydrogenase level more than twice the upper limit of normal. Similarly, patients with acute myeloid leukemia, or AML, and a white count over 100,000, or any patient with bulky disease and a high LDH fall into this category. The intermediate risk group includes all patients with a lower white count and LDH, AML patients with a white count between 25,000 and 100,000, and those with bulky, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. Notably, patients with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL, being treated with venetoclax are also considered intermediate risk. Finally, the low-risk group includes patients with indolent lymphomas, CLL treated with standard chemotherapy, multiple myeloma, and most solid tumors. It is crucial to remember that high-risk patients may require monitoring in an intensive care unit setting. Beyond the malignancy itself, we must assess both tumor-related and patient-related factors to refine our risk assessment. On one hand, tumor factors that increase risk include a high tumor burden, such as bulky lymph nodes greater than 5 or 10 centimeters, an elevated LDH level more than twice the upper limit of normal, and a very high white blood cell count. The intrinsic properties of the cancer, like a high proliferation rate and high sensitivity to chemotherapy, also contribute significantly. Finally, the presence of bone marrow involvement is another key tumor-related risk factor. On the other hand, we have patient factors. Pre-existing renal impairment is one of the most significant. Other factors include oliguria or dehydration, a baseline elevated uric acid or phosphate level, direct renal involvement by the tumor, and, importantly, inadequate hydration during treatment. The key takeaway here is that a comprehensive risk assessment requires you to evaluate both the tumor's characteristics and the patient's underlying condition before you initiate therapy. The cornerstone of TLS management is a risk-stratified prevention strategy. Let's walk through the algorithm. First, for any patient starting chemotherapy, you must assess their TLS risk category, as we just discussed. Second, for all patients deemed to be at risk, you must initiate hydration. This typically involves intravenous fluids at a rate of 2 to 3 liters per meter squared per day. The goal is to maintain a robust urine output of at least 100 milliliters per meter squared per hour. It is absolutely critical that there is NO potassium in these 4 fluids. If urine output is inadequate despite hydration, loop diuretics may be considered. Third, you will choose a hypouricemic agent based on the patient's risk level. For low or intermediate risk patients, Allopurinol is the standard of care. Febuxostat is an alternative option for patients who are unable to take allopurinol. For high-risk patients, Rasburicase is the drug of choice. A key exception is in patients with a G6PD deficiency, where Rasburicase is contraindicated and allopurinol or febuxostat must be used instead. Finally, a very important update to older practices. Urine alkalinization with sodium bicarbonate is no longer recommended. We now know that it can actually worsen the precipitation of calcium phosphate crystals in the kidneys. Let's compare our main pharmacologic agents for prevention. It's essential to know when to use each. For low to intermediate risk patients, the primary strategy is to block the production of new uric acid using a xanthine oxidase inhibitor. The most common agent is allopurinol. Its mechanism is to block the final step in uric acid production. The typical adult dose is 300 milligrams per day, and it should be started 2 to 3 days before chemotherapy begins. For patients who are unable to take allopurinol, for instance due to hypersensitivity, febuxostat is an excellent alternative. It is also a xanthine oxidase inhibitor and serves the same prophylactic purpose. A major limitation of both of these agents is that they do not lower existing uric acid levels. They only prevent its formation. Therefore, their primary role is for prophylaxis in low to intermediate risk patients. In contrast, Rasburicase is a recombinant urate oxidase enzyme. Its mechanism is to convert existing uric acid into allantoin, which is much more soluble and easily excreted by the kidneys. It is typically given as a single fixed dose of 3 to 6 milligrams and works very rapidly, reducing uric acid levels within just 4 hours. This makes it the agent of choice for high-risk patients and for those who already have established hyperuricemia at baseline. However, Rasburicase has a critical contraindication. It must never be given to patients with G6PD deficiency, as it can induce severe hemolysis and methemoglobinemia. One final lab tip: when a patient has received Rasburicase, any blood samples drawn for uric acid measurement must be placed on ice immediately. This prevents the enzyme from continuing to break down uric acid in the tube, which would lead to a falsely low reading. Once prevention is initiated, frequent laboratory monitoring becomes essential for at-risk patients. The frequency of monitoring is dictated by the patient's risk level. For high-risk patients, you must check electrolytes, including potassium, phosphate, calcium, along with uric acid and creatinine every 4 to 6 hours. For intermediate-risk patients, this can be extended to every 6 to 8 hours. For low-risk patients, monitoring every 12 to 24 hours is generally sufficient. In addition to labs, other monitoring is crucial. This includes continuous cardiac monitoring for any signs of hyperkalemia-induced arrhythmias, strict tracking of intake and output, and daily weights to assess fluid status. An ECG should be obtained if the serum potassium rises above 6.0 or if the patient becomes symptomatic. You should have a low threshold to escalate the level of care if you see concerning trends, such as a rising creatinine despite hydration, a potassium level climbing above 6.5, symptomatic hypocalcemia, or persistent oliguria. Of all the metabolic derangements in TLS, hyperkalemia is the most immediately life-threatening. You must be prepared to manage it aggressively. A potassium level greater than 6.5 millimoles per liter or the presence of ECG changes constitutes a medical emergency. The management follows a stepwise approach. Step 1 is to immediately remove all sources of potassium. This means discontinuing any potassium in 4 fluids or medications and holding any drugs that can increase potassium, such as potassium-sparing diuretics, ACE inhibitors, or ARBs. Step 2 is cardiac protection. If there are any ECG changes, such as peaked T waves or a widened QRS complex, you must administer intravenous calcium gluconate immediately to stabilize the cardiac membrane. Step 3 is to shift potassium intracellularly. This is a temporizing measure and is achieved with an infusion of insulin and glucose, nebulized beta agonists like albuterol, and, if the patient is acidotic, sodium bicarbonate. Step 4 is to actually remove potassium from the body. This can be done with potassium binders like Pyramer or sodium zirconium cyclosilicate, or with loop diuretics if the patient is still making urine. However, the most effective and definitive treatment for severe hyperkalemia is hemodialysis. Next, let's discuss the management of hyperphosphatemia and its counterpart, hypocalcemia. These two abnormalities require careful, coordinated management. For hyperphosphatemia, the first step is a phosphorus-restricted diet. We then use oral phosphate binders to prevent absorption from the gut. Sevelamer is often preferred. Aluminum hydroxide can be used, but only for a short duration. It is critical to avoid calcium-based binders, as this increases the calcium phosphate product and the risk of precipitation. Aggressive hydration helps with renal excretion, but for severe or refractory cases, dialysis is required, with continuous renal replacement therapy, or CRRT, being the preferred modality. For hypocalcemia, there is one critical teaching point. You must correct the hyperphosphatemia first before you even consider giving calcium. Why? Because giving calcium in the setting of high phosphate will simply fuel the fire, causing more calcium phosphate precipitation and worsening tissue damage. Therefore, you should only treat hypocalcemia if the patient is symptomatic, experiencing tetany, muscle spasms, cardiac arrhythmias, or seizures. Routine supplementation is to be avoided. Always be mindful of the calcium phosphate product. If it exceeds 60, the risk of widespread tissue calcification is very high. In severe cases of tumor lysis syndrome, renal replacement therapy or dialysis can be a life-saving intervention. The indications for initiating dialysis include severe hyperkalemia that is refractory to medical management and severe hyperphosphatemia that is not responding to phosphate binders. It is also indicated for symptomatic hypocalcemia that occurs in the setting of concurrent hyperphosphatemia, as this is a situation where you cannot safely administer calcium. Other indications include oliguric or anuric acute kidney injury, volume overload that is unresponsive to diuretics, and any case of rapidly worsening renal function. When dialysis is needed, continuous renal replacement therapy, or CRRT, is generally preferred over intermittent hemodialysis. CRRT provides better and more sustained clearance of phosphorus, which is a time-dependent process. It also prevents the rebound hyperphosphatemia that can be seen after a session of intermittent dialysis and offers greater hemodynamic stability for critically ill patients. The key point here is to have a low threshold for a nephrology consultation in any patient with significant TLS. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's summarize with 8 essential pearls for managing tumor lysis syndrome. 1. Anticipate. Always anticipate TLS in patients with a high tumor burden who are starting effective therapy. 2. Start prevention before. Initiate your preventive measures before the first dose of chemotherapy is given. 3. Hydrate. Use aggressive intravenous hydration and ensure there is no potassium in the fluids. 4. Check G6PD. Always check for G6PD deficiency before you even consider administering Rasburicase. 5. Monitor frequently. In high-risk patients, this means checking labs every 4 to 6 hours. 6. Avoid calcium. Do not give calcium supplementation unless the patient is clearly symptomatic from hypocalcemia. 7. No urine alkalinization. This is an outdated practice and can be harmful. 8. Low threshold. Finally, have a low threshold to consult nephrology and consider dialysis early. The overarching message is that prevention is always better than treatment. Your goal is to identify the risk and act early. This algorithm provides a quick reference for putting it all together. When a patient is starting chemotherapy, first assess their TLS risk. For low-risk patients, the strategy includes oral hydration, a xanthine oxidase inhibitor like Allopurinol or febuxostat, and monitoring every 12 to 24 hours. For intermediate-risk patients, we escalate to 4 hydration and a xanthine oxidase inhibitor like Allopurinol or febuxostat. Rasburicase may be considered if there is baseline renal dysfunction or already elevated electrolytes. Monitoring should be every 6 to 8 hours. For high-risk patients, the standard is aggressive 4 hydration in an ICU setting for Burkitt's and prophylactic Rasburicase after confirming a negative G6PD status. Monitoring must be very frequent, every 4 to 6 hours. And if, despite these measures, TLS develops, the management involves aggressive 4 hydration, treating the specific electrolyte abnormalities as we've discussed, considering dialysis early, and getting a nephrology consultation. That concludes our presentation on tumor lysis syndrome in adults. Thank you for your time and attention. We can now open the floor for questions and discussion. As a final reminder, the information provided here was for medical education only and is not a substitute for clinical judgment in patient care.